Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're confronting a conflict that is, quite frankly, reshaping the very ground we walk on. You see, what begins as a localized standoff in the Middle East rarely ever stays there. We are unpacking the escalating tensions between the United States and Iran, but more importantly, we're looking at the devastating global domino effect this rivalry triggers across the entire planet. This is an exploration of how regional geopolitics instantly transforms into a global crisis.
So what happens when a single miscalculation in the Middle East shakes the entire global economy? Because let's be clear, this isn't just about military maneuvers, troop deployments, or distant front lines. The consequences of this conflict stretch far, far beyond local geography. A missile exchange in the Persian Gulf travels instantly through the arteries of global commerce. It directly hits international inflation rates, flashes red across currency screens in global financial capitals, and threatens the fundamental energy security of nations literally thousands of miles away from the initial point of impact.
Part 1. The historical rupture. Decades of broken trust. To truly grasp the immense military pressure we're seeing today, we actually have to take a step back and examine the deep historical wounds that completely shattered the trust between these two nations. This hostility didn't just materialize overnight. The decisive rupture really hit in 1953, with a CIA-backed coup that removed Iran's Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh after he tried to nationalize the country's oil industry. In Iranian political memory, that operation became the absolute, defining proof of foreign manipulation. Fast forward to 1979, the Islamic Revolution overthrew the pro-Western Shah, completely transforming Iran into an Islamic republic vehemently opposed to Western influence. And this seismic shift was immediately followed by the storming of the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and a grueling 444-day hostage crisis. That specific sequence of events deeply humiliated Washington and forged an incredibly durable, hardened rivalry. Decades later, immense diplomatic capital was spent on the 2015 JCPOA nuclear deal. It briefly offered a path forward, but ultimately collapsed, leaving the relationship even more fractured than before.
The core truth of this conflict is actually quite simple. Wars begin when trust collapses and memory hardens into doctrine. This standoff is driven just as much by historical memory, national humiliation, and the fierce defense of sovereignty as it is by modern nuclear policy or territorial ambition. When a rupture like this becomes deeply embedded in a nation's identity, every subsequent negotiation, every diplomatic back channel is heavily burdened by the unresolved ghosts of the past.
Part 2. A cycle of escalation. Modern warfare dynamics. The rivalry has now shifted from a cold, ideological containment strategy to an active, modern battlefield defined by layered military confrontation.
Today, these powers engage through fundamentally opposing doctrines. It's like watching two completely different playbooks. The United States projects power through conventional dominance, relying on overwhelming military deterrence, aircraft carrier strike groups, and intense economic sanctions designed to lock adversaries out of the global banking system. Add to that immense international coalition pressure. Iran, on the other hand, being outgunned conventionally, operates on a highly sophisticated doctrine of deterrence through dispersion. They rely on a sprawling network of proxy militias across the Middle East, utilizing asymmetric drone warfare and calculated retaliation. Essentially, Iran's strategic logic is to make the entire region less safe for its adversaries, forcing the physical and political costs outward. It is a complex, multidimensional conflict involving cyber risks, covert operations, and political signaling that reaches way beyond traditional interstate warfare. And this dynamic creates what military strategists call the escalation trap. Imagine a highly volatile situation where both sides maintain immense, compounding pressure simply because they cannot afford to appear weak to their domestic audiences or regional allies. As each side escalates to establish deterrence, they severely shrink the space for diplomacy and drastically increase the risk of an all-out war. Modern conflict is basically an exercise in controlled risk. But here's the catch. Controlled risk can fail in an instant. When a radar signal is misread, when a rogue proxy acts independently, or when overwhelming domestic political pressures strip a leader of their off-ramps.
Part 3. Choke point. The Strait of Hormuz. Now we must shift our focus to the geographic anchor of this entire crisis, a narrow waterway that serves as one of the world's most critical energy arteries.
Panic spreads through the global maritime system in a very predictable yet devastating sequence. First, military tensions elevate in the Persian Gulf. Almost immediately, maritime insurers and hubs like London respond to the perceived risk, drastically spiking war risk insurance premiums for commercial vessels.
This, of course, triggers a massive surge in overall shipping freight costs. And finally, this culminates in deep global supply chain fears. The vital realization here is that a physical blockade isn't even necessary to inflict severe economic damage. The mere threat of disruption in the strait instantly paralyzes logistics and distorts markets long before a single commercial ship is actually stopped.
And the real-world economic pain is immediate and severe. When benchmarks like Brent and Dubai crude spike due to regional instability, those shockwaves ripple outward through the entire global economy. Transport and logistics costs surge. Essential commodities like fertilizer become prohibitively expensive, which directly drives up global food prices and threatens food security in highly vulnerable regions. Manufacturing output slows down under the crushing weight of expensive energy. Ultimately, this friction accelerates inflation pressures worldwide, forcing central banks everywhere to hike interest rates and completely rethink their macroeconomic assumptions.
But for one nation in particular, these global ripples represent an acute systemic vulnerability. So what happens when this shockwave reaches India? Part 4. India's strategic exposure. For India, this is absolutely not a distant, abstract headline. This is a live, immediate threat to national security and macroeconomic stability. 65%. Let that sink in for a moment. That is the staggering share of India's crude oil imported directly from the Middle East. When we discuss the intricacies of global geopolitics, this is where the theory grounds itself into a hard, wallet-level reality for the Indian economy. This is the literal fuel that powers a nation of 1.4 billion people, driving its manufacturing sectors and running its vast domestic logistics networks. India's energy security is deeply, irrevocably tethered to Gulf stability. But the strategic exposure extends far beyond just barrels of crude oil. India depends heavily on the Middle East for vital bilateral trade and export markets. Furthermore, the Gulf hosts nearly 9 million Indian citizens. These expatriates sent home an immense volume of remittances. We're talking tens of billions of dollars annually, which serve as a crucial socioeconomic lifeline for multiple Indian states.
A conflict in the Gulf triggers a compounding economic crisis for New Delhi. It's a chain reaction. Surging crude prices artificially inflate the national import bill. This outflow of foreign exchange leads directly to a widening current account deficit. That deficit, in turn, applies immense downward pressure, causing a weakening of the Indian rupee against the dollar, making all other imports more expensive. Simultaneously, if the Gulf economy softens due to the friction of war, we see a dangerous slowing of those vital Gulf remittances. And we absolutely cannot overlook the logistics. Airspace restrictions over conflict zones necessitate longer, significantly costlier aviation routes for international trade and travel.
Part 5. Navigating the fallout. The way ahead. Nations must pragmatically brace for impact and actively push for de-escalation, because the systemic costs of uncontrolled conflict are simply too high.
Survival in this volatile era requires active, multi-layered resilience. India and nations with similar geopolitical footprints must aggressively diversify their energy supply chains, reaching far beyond the Middle East to secure steady flows. Simultaneously, they've got to strengthen domestic strategic petroleum reserves to absorb sudden supply shocks. Naval capabilities must be optimized to protect critical maritime trade routes and ensure absolute freedom of navigation. Finally, fiscal policymakers must preemptively prepare the domestic economy to weather the inevitable inflationary shocks. You simply cannot separate the military understanding of a region from the economic planning required to survive its conflicts.
In a connected world, a war far away can still end up in the price of fuel at home. When the Gulf shakes, the entire world trembles. Geopolitics is deeply, irrevocably intertwined with the daily lives of citizens everywhere. So the ultimate question remains, how prepared is your own country's economy for the next global shockwave? Thank you for joining me on this explainer.